The evening sun was starting to set over Maple Ridge, one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. Big houses with perfect lawns lined both sides of the street. Most of these homes cost more than what regular folks make in 10 years. It was the kind of place where people drove expensive cars and never worried about money. Officer Danny Rodriguez had been patrolling this area for about 3 years now. At 32 years old, he thought he knew everything about keeping the peace in wealthy neighborhoods. Danny had this idea in his head that he could spot trouble from a mile away. He believed he had a special talent for knowing who belonged where and who didn't. On this particular Tuesday evening, Danny was driving his patrol car slowly down Oak Street when something caught his eye. An older black man was driving a simple, gray Toyota Camry. The car wasn't fancy at all. It looked like something a teacher or store clerk might drive. But that wasn't what made Danny pay attention. What bothered Danny was how carefully the man was driving. He was going exactly 25 miles per hour in a 25 zone. His hands were perfectly placed on the steering wheel. He stopped completely at every stop sign and used his turn signals way before making any turns. To most people, this would seem like perfect driving. But to Danny, it felt suspicious. Nobody drives that carefully unless they're hiding something, Danny muttered to himself as he started following the Toyota. The elderly man behind the wheel was Judge Robert Washington, though Danny had no idea who he was. At 68 years old, Judge Washington had spent most of his life being extra careful about everything, especially when driving through neighborhoods like this one. He had learned long ago that being a black man in certain areas meant he had to be twice as careful as everyone else. Judge Washington was actually heading home from his grandson's soccer game. The boy had scored 2 goals and the judge was still smiling about it. His grandson had run up to him after the game, grass stains on his uniform, asking if Grandpa saw his amazing kicks. These were the moments that made Judge Washington forget about all the serious cases he dealt with at work. As he drove through Maple Ridge, Judge Washington noticed the police car following him. His smile slowly faded. He had been through this dance before many times over the years. Even though he now held one of the most important jobs in the country, he knew that in moments like this, all people saw was an old black man in a regular car. Danny continued following the Toyota for about 6 blocks. In his mind, he was building a case. The man was driving too slow. He kept checking his mirrors. He seemed nervous. These were all signs that something wasn't right, at least according to Danny's way of thinking. The truth was that Judge Washington wasn't nervous about anything illegal. He was nervous because he recognized the pattern. A police car following him for no good reason usually meant trouble was coming. He had seen this happen to countless people in his courtroom over the years. Good people who were just going about their day, suddenly finding themselves having to explain why they existed in certain spaces. Danny finally decided to make his move. He hit his lights and gave a short burst of his siren. In his radio, he called it in, Unit 12 making a traffic stop on Oak Street. Suspicious vehicle in the area. Judge Washington's heart sank a little, but he wasn't surprised. He carefully pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to find a spot under a streetlight where everything would be visible. He turned off his car, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. This wasn't Judge Washington's first time being pulled over for no real reason. When he was younger, before he became a lawyer and then a judge, these stops used to make him angry. Now they just made him tired of having to prove he belonged wherever he happened to be. Danny parked his patrol car behind the Toyota and sat there for a moment, sizing up the situation. He looked at the man in the car ahead of him and made all sorts of wrong assumptions. He saw an older black man in a regular car in a rich neighborhood, and his mind jumped to conclusions. What Danny couldn't see was that Judge Washington had been living in a house just 2 streets over for the past 15 years. He couldn't see that this man had worked his way through law school while supporting his family. He couldn't see the decades of hard work, the late nights studying, the years of fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. All Danny saw was what he expected to see based on his own limited view of the world. As Danny got out of his patrol car, Judge Washington took a deep breath. He had been in situations like this before, but they never got easier. The difference now was that he understood the law better than most people on the planet. He knew his rights, but he also knew that knowing your rights and having them respected were two very different things. Judge Washington watched in his side mirror as the officer approached. The man looked young, maybe in his early 30s. He was walking with the kind of swagger that suggested he thought he was in complete control of the situation. Judge Washington had seen that walk before, in his courtroom, from officers who thought their badge gave them the right to treat people however they wanted. Danny reached the driver's side window and immediately started talking in the tone he used when he wanted to sound official and intimidating. "Good evening, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" It was a classic opening line designed to get people to admit to something, anything, that might justify the stop. Judge Washington had heard this question asked thousands of times in his courtroom. He knew it was often the first step in turning a simple encounter into something much more complicated. Judge Washington looked up at the officer with calm, tired eyes. "Good evening, officer. No, I don't know why you stopped me. Could you please tell me what traffic law I violated?" His voice was polite but firm. He wasn't being difficult, just asking for basic information that any citizen had the right to know. But Danny heard something else entirely. He heard what he thought was attitude, a challenge to his authority. The quiet street around them seemed to hold its breath. A few other cars drove by slowly, their drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. Some people in the big houses started peeking through their curtains, curious about the police lights flashing in their peaceful neighborhood. Neither man knew it yet, but this simple traffic stop was about to become something much bigger than either of them could imagine. Danny stared down at Judge Washington through the car window, his chest puffed out like he was trying to make himself look bigger and more important. The question about what traffic law was violated seemed to irritate him. In his mind, he didn't need a good reason to pull someone over if they looked out of place. "I'll ask the questions here, sir," Danny said, his voice getting a little sharper. "License and registration, please, and keep your hands where I can see them." Judge Washington had been through this routine more times than he cared to count. Even though it frustrated him deeply, he knew that cooperating was the safest path. Forward. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket for his wallet, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. "I'm reaching for my wallet now, officer," he said clearly, wanting to avoid any misunderstandings. As Judge Washington handed over his driver's license, Danny snatched it quickly and held it up to his flashlight. The name on the license read, Robert Washington, with an address just a few streets away in the same neighborhood. This should have ended Danny's suspicions right there, but instead, it seemed to make him more agitated. "This your real address?" Danny asked, squinting at the license like he was examining evidence in a major crime. "Yes, officer, it is," Judge Washington replied calmly. "I've lived there for 15 years. Danny's eyebrows shot up. He couldn't believe that this older black man actually lived in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. In his narrow view of the world, this just didn't make sense. Instead of accepting the obvious truth, his mind started racing with other possibilities. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Washington?" Danny asked, emphasizing the name like he didn't quite believe it was real. Judge Washington paused for a moment. He could have ended this whole situation right there by mentioning his position, but something inside him wanted to see how far this officer would go. He wanted to understand what regular people went through when they didn't have the protection of his title and status. "I work in government," Judge Washington said simply, which was technically true but didn't give away his real job. Danny let out a little snort, like he found this answer amusing or hard to believe. "Government work, huh? What department?" "The judicial branch," Judge Washington replied, still keeping his answer vague but honest. This response seemed to fly right over Danny's head. He was so focused on proving his own assumptions that he wasn't really listening to the answers. In his mind, he had already decided that something fishy was going on, and he was determined to figure out what it was. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Danny ordered, taking a step back from the car. Judge Washington felt his heart rate increase slightly. This was where these situations often took a turn for the worse. He had seen too many cases in his courtroom where a simple traffic stop escalated into something dangerous because an officer decided to flex his authority. "Officer, may I ask why you need me to exit my vehicle?" Judge Washington asked politely. "I've provided my identification and you can see that I live in this neighborhood. What traffic violation am I being cited for?" Danny's face flushed red. He interpreted these reasonable questions as a direct challenge to his authority. In his training, he had been taught that when people asked too many questions, it meant they were hiding something or trying to take control of the situation. "Don't make this difficult, sir," Danny said, his hand moving unconsciously toward his belt. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." The threat was subtle, but clear. Judge Washington had presided over enough cases to recognize when a situation was heading toward potential violence. He also knew that his best protection right now was the fact that they were on a well-lit street where other people could see what was happening. As if reading his thoughts, a car drove by slowly, the driver clearly watching the scene unfold. The person in the passenger seat was holding up a phone, probably recording. This was 2024, and people had learned to document these encounters whenever they saw them happening. "I'm going to comply with your request, officer," Judge Washington said in a steady voice. "But I want to be clear that I'm only doing so to avoid escalation. I don't believe you have legal grounds for this request." Danny's jaw tightened. He didn't like being lectured about legal grounds by someone he had already decided was suspicious. "Just get out of the car and we can clear this whole thing up quickly." Judge Washington slowly opened his car door and stepped out. At 68 years old, he moved carefully, his knees creaking a little from the soccer game where he had been sitting on uncomfortable bleachers for 2 hours. He stood with his hands visible at his sides, maintaining eye contact with Danny without being confrontational. Now that they were face to face, Danny could see that Judge Washington was well dressed, in a clean button-down shirt and slacks. His shoes were polished and his gray hair was neatly trimmed. Everything about his appearance suggested he was exactly what he claimed to be, a respectable person who lived in the neighborhood. But Danny's mind had already locked onto a different narrative. Instead of seeing evidence that contradicted his assumptions, he doubled down on his suspicions. "So you're telling me you live around here and work for the government?" Danny said, pacing back and forth like he was interrogating a suspect. "That's a pretty convenient story. How do I know you didn't just steal this car from someone in the neighborhood?" Judge Washington blinked slowly, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Officer, you have my valid driver's license with my correct address. You can run my plates and see that the car is registered to me. What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe you're not being completely honest with me," Danny replied, his voice getting louder. "Maybe you borrowed this car from someone. Or maybe someone let you use their address to get that license. There are all kinds of scams people run these days." Another car had stopped across the street and Judge Washington could see someone else, with a phone pointed in their direction. Word was probably already spreading on social media about what was happening. In the age of viral videos, police encounters like this one often became national news within hours. Judge Washington took a deep breath and tried one more time to de-escalate the situation through reason and dignity. "Officer, I understand you're trying to do your job, but I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I'm a law-abiding citizen who was simply driving home from my grandson's soccer game. I haven't violated any traffic laws. I've cooperated with all your requests and I've provided valid identification. What would it take to resolve this situation peacefully?" Danny stared at him for a long moment, and for just a second, Judge Washington thought he might be getting through to the young officer. Maybe common sense would prevail, and they could both walk away from this encounter without it becoming something they would both regret. But then Danny's radio crackled to life, and his supervisor's voice came through asking for a status update. Suddenly, Danny felt like he was on stage, like he had to prove to his colleagues that he was in control of the situation. The possibility of admitting he had made a mistake seemed to evaporate completely. "Here's what's going to happen," Danny said, his voice taking on a tone that Judge Washington recognized from his courtroom, the sound of someone about to make a very bad decision. Danny's supervisor's voice crackled through the radio again, asking for an update on the traffic stop. The sound made Danny feel like everyone was watching him, waiting to see if he could handle the situation properly. Instead of making him more careful, it made him more determined to prove he was right about Judge Washington. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Danny ordered, his voice now carrying the kind of authority he thought made him sound professional. Judge Washington felt a chill run down his spine. This was exactly the kind of moment he had seen lead to tragedy in too many cases that came through his courtroom. He knew that complying might not protect him, but refusing would definitely make things worse. "Officer, I need to respectfully ask what crime you suspect me of committing," Judge Washington said, keeping his voice steady despite his growing concern. "I have the right to know why I'm being treated like a suspect." Danny's face grew red with frustration. In his mind, Judge Washington was being difficult and trying to tell him how to do his job. He had been trained to see questions about his authority as signs of guilt or resistance. "You're being treated like a suspect because you're acting suspicious," Danny shot back. "Normal people don't ask all these questions, they just cooperate and let me do my job." By now, more cars had slowed down to watch what was happening. Some people had pulled over completely and were standing on the sidewalk with their phones out. Judge Washington could see at least 5 different people recording the encounter from various angles. In the back of his mind, he realized this was probably going to end up on the internet no matter how it played out. An older woman who lived in one of the nearby houses had come out onto her porch. She was too far away to hear the conversation, but she could see that something wasn't right about the situation. She pulled out her own phone and started recording while calling out to her neighbor. "Hey, Helen, come look at this. That police officer is giving that poor man a really hard time, for no reason I can see." Judge Washington heard her voice carrying across the evening air, and it gave him a small sense of comfort to know that other people were witnessing what was happening. These recordings might be the only thing standing between him and a much worse outcome. Danny heard the woman's comment too, and it made him even more defensive. Now he felt like he had an audience judging his every move. Instead of reconsidering his approach, he decided he needed to show everyone that he was in charge of the situation. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Danny said, moving closer to Judge Washington. "If you don't comply, I'm going to have to assume you're resisting arrest." The word arrest hung in the air like a threat. Judge Washington knew that once an officer decided to arrest someone, the situation often spiraled out of control quickly. He had seen too many cases where people ended up hurt or worse because a simple encounter turned into an arrest over nothing. "Officer, I want to be very clear about something," Judge Washington said, his voice taking on a tone that anyone who knew him from the courtroom would recognize. "I am not resisting anything. I am exercising my constitutional right to ask questions about why I'm being detained. Those are 2 very different things under the law." Danny didn't like being lectured about the law, especially not by someone he had already decided was probably a criminal. "Oh, so now you're a lawyer too?" he said with a sarcastic laugh. "First you're a government worker, now you're giving me legal advice. Your story keeps changing, doesn't it?" Judge Washington almost smiled at the irony, but he caught himself. This wasn't the time for humor, even though the situation was becoming absurd. "Officer, I haven't changed my story at all. I told you, I work in government, specifically in the judicial branch. Having knowledge of constitutional law comes with that territory." "Right, the judicial branch," Danny repeated mockingly. "Let me guess, you're a court clerk or something like that?" Before Judge Washington could answer, Danny's radio crackled again. This time it was dispatch calling all available units to assist with a robbery in progress across town. Danny looked frustrated that his colleagues were dealing with real police work while he was stuck with what he still believed was a suspicious person who wouldn't cooperate. "Unit 7 responding to assist," came a voice through the radio. Then, another unit called in, and another. Danny realized that backup wasn't coming anytime soon, and he was going to have to handle this situation by himself. The crowd of onlookers was growing. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood's group chat, and more residents were coming out to see what was happening on their usually quiet street. Most of them knew Judge Washington by sight, even if they didn't know exactly who he was. He was the older gentleman who walked his dog every morning and always waved hello. Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down, recognized him immediately. She had chatted with him many times about gardening when she saw him working in his yard, and she couldn't understand why a police officer was treating such a nice, polite man like he was dangerous. "So that's Mr. Washington," she said to her husband loud enough for others to hear. "He lives right over on Elm Street. He's one of the nicest people in the neighborhood. I don't understand what this officer thinks he's doing." Danny heard her comment and felt even more embarrassed. If this man really lived in the neighborhood, then Danny's entire theory about him being suspicious was falling apart. But instead of backing down, Danny doubled down on his position. "Ma'am, please step back and let me handle this situation," Danny called out to Mrs. Chen. "Just because someone lives somewhere doesn't mean they can't be involved in criminal activity." Judge Washington watched this exchange with a mixture of sadness and professional interest. He was seeing firsthand how an officer's ego and preconceived notions could turn a simple interaction into a public spectacle. He had read about situations like this in case files, but experiencing it personally was different. "Officer," Judge Washington said quietly, trying to get Danny's attention back, "I think we both know this situation has gotten out of hand. Why don't we take a step back and think about how we can resolve this peacefully? You have my identification. You can verify that I live here, and multiple neighbors have confirmed they know me. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish at this point?" Danny looked around at all the people watching and recording. He could see the disapproval on their faces, and it made him feel defensive and angry. In his mind, they just didn't understand how difficult police work could be. They didn't realize that he was trying to keep their neighborhood safe. "What I'm trying to accomplish," Danny said, his voice rising, "is making sure that people who don't belong in this neighborhood aren't up to no good. And right now your refusal to cooperate is making me think I was right to be suspicious." The logic was completely backwards, but Danny was too invested in his original assumption to see it clearly. He had decided Judge Washington was suspicious, and every piece of evidence that contradicted that assumption was somehow twisted in his mind to support it instead. Judge Washington realized that reasoning with this officer wasn't going to work. Danny had painted himself into a corner, and his pride wouldn't let him admit he had made a mistake. The situation was about to get much worse before it got better. "Officer, I'm going to ask you one more time to tell me what specific law you believe I've broken," Judge Washington said with the kind of quiet authority that made lawyers nervous in his courtroom. "Because if you can't answer that question, then what you're doing right now is harassment, and all these people recording are documenting it." Danny's hand moved toward his handcuffs, and everyone watching held their breath. Danny's hand hovered over his handcuffs as he stared at Judge Washington. The crowd of neighbors watching from across the street had grown to about 15 people, all holding their phones and whispering among themselves. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost touch it. Judge Washington knew he was at a crossroads. He could continue trying to handle this like any other citizen and hope that common sense would eventually prevail. Or he could end this situation right now by revealing who he really was. The problem was he had wanted to see how far this officer would go when he thought he was dealing with just another black man in a nice neighborhood. Now he had his answer, and it wasn't pretty. "Officer, before you do something you're going to regret, I need to show you something else," Judge Washington said calmly, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. Danny immediately tensed up. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he shouted, loud enough that several neighbors jumped. "I'm reaching for additional identification," Judge Washington said clearly, making sure everyone could hear him. "I'm moving very slowly, and you can see exactly what I'm doing." Judge Washington pulled out a small leather wallet that looked different from his regular one. Inside was a special identification card that most people never got to see. It was his judicial credentials, the ID that proved he was a sitting justice on the highest court in the land. Danny watched suspiciously as Judge Washington opened the wallet and held it out for him to see. At first, Danny just glanced at it quickly, expecting to see some fake ID or maybe a business card that was supposed to impress him. But when his eyes focused on the official seal and the words printed clearly across the top, his expression changed completely. The blood drained from his face so fast that he actually took a step backward. The ID card read, Robert L. Washington, Associate Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. Danny blinked hard, thinking maybe he was seeing things wrong. He grabbed the wallet from Judge Washington's hands and held it closer to his flashlight. The official government seal was right there, along with a photo that clearly matched the man standing in front of him. This can't be real, Danny stammered, his voice suddenly much quieter than it had been a few seconds earlier. I assure you it's very real, Judge Washington replied with the same calm tone he had been using all evening. Officer, my name is Justice Robert Washington, and I sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. I've been trying to tell you that. I work in the judicial branch, but you seemed more interested in your own assumptions than in listening to my answers. Danny's mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. He had just spent the last 20 minutes treating one of the most powerful people in the country like a common criminal. Worse than that, he had done it in front of a crowd of people who were recording everything. Mrs. Chen, who was still watching from her porch, gasped loud enough for everyone to hear. Oh my goodness, that's Justice Washington. I knew I recognized him from somewhere. He's been on the news so many times. Other neighbors started murmuring to each other as the news spread through the crowd. Several people were already typing frantically on their phones, probably posting about what they were witnessing on social media. Danny looked around at all the faces staring at him, and for the first time since the traffic stop began, he realized how badly he had messed up. This wasn't just about making a mistake with a regular citizen anymore. He had racially profiled and harassed a Supreme Court justice. Sir, I didn't know, Danny started to say, but Judge Washington held up a hand to stop him. Officer, the fact that you didn't know who I was isn't really the problem here, Judge Washington said, his voice still calm but carrying more weight now. The problem is how you treated me when you thought I was just another black man driving through this neighborhood. Do you think your behavior tonight would have been acceptable if I was a teacher or a mechanic or someone who works at the grocery store? Danny's face turned red again, but this time it was from embarrassment rather than anger. He was starting to understand that Judge Washington wasn't just talking about this one traffic stop. He was talking about something much bigger. I was just trying to do my job, Danny said weakly, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. No, officer, you weren't, Judge Washington replied firmly. You were acting on assumptions and prejudices. I committed no traffic violations. I answered all your questions politely. I provided valid identification that proved I live in this neighborhood. But none of that mattered to you because you had already decided I didn't belong here based on the color of my skin. The crowd of neighbors was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Many of them were recording everything, knowing they were witnessing something that would probably be talked about for years to come. Just then, another police car pulled up with its lights flashing. Danny's supervisor, Sergeant Martinez, got out and immediately sensed that something was very wrong. He had been in law enforcement for 20 years and he could read a bad situation from 50 feet away. What's going on here, Rodriguez? Sergeant Martinez called out as he walked over to where Danny and Judge Washington were standing. Danny looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Sergeant, there's been a misunderstanding. Sergeant Martinez looked at Judge Washington, and unlike his subordinate, he recognized the face immediately. As a senior officer, he had been required to attend training sessions about constitutional law and police conduct. Justice Washington had been featured in several of those training videos. Oh no, Sergeant Martinez said under his breath, then louder. Justice Washington, I am so sorry about this situation. Please accept my sincerest apologies. Danny's eyes went wide as he watched his supervisor practically bow to the man he had been harassing just minutes earlier. The reality of what he had done was finally sinking in completely. Justice Washington nodded to Sergeant Martinez. Sergeant, I appreciate your apology, but I want to be clear about something. I'm not upset because of who I am. I'm upset because of what this encounter says about how your department treats citizens who don't have the protection of my title and position. Sergeant Martinez understood immediately. This wasn't just about one bad traffic stop. This was about a pattern of behavior that could end careers and destroy the department's reputation in the community. Justice Washington, would you be willing to discuss this situation with me privately? Sergeant Martinez asked. I think there are some things we need to address immediately. Judge Washington looked around at all the neighbors still watching and recording. He knew that by tomorrow morning this story would be everywhere. The videos would be on every news channel and social media platform. His name would be trending on Twitter before he even got home. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was time for people to see exactly what happened when prejudice and power came together on a quiet street in America. Sergeant, I'm happy to discuss this with you, Judge Washington said. But I want this conversation to happen right here, in front of these citizens who witnessed what occurred tonight. They deserve to hear how their police department plans to address this situation. Danny realized that his career might be over before the night was through. But more than that, he was starting to understand that he had been wrong about much more than just this one traffic stop. Sergeant Martinez looked around at the crowd of neighbors, all still holding their phones and watching every move. He knew that whatever happened next would be recorded and shared with the world. This wasn't just a conversation between police officers anymore. This was a public moment that could define how their entire department was viewed by the community. Justice Washington, Sergeant Martinez began carefully. I want to make sure we handle this situation properly. Officer Rodriguez clearly made some serious errors in judgment tonight. Danny stood there looking like he wanted to disappear. His hands were shaking slightly and sweat was forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He kept glancing between his supervisor and Justice Washington, waiting for someone to tell him his career was over. But Justice Washington surprised everyone with what he said next. Sergeant, before we talk about punishment or consequences, I want to ask your officer a question. He turned to face Danny directly. Officer Rodriguez, do you understand what happened here tonight? Not just that you made a mistake, but do you understand why this situation occurred in the first place? Danny swallowed hard. He had been expecting anger or demands for his immediate firing. Instead, he was being asked to think about his actions in a way that made him uncomfortable. I guess I made some wrong assumptions, Danny said quietly, his voice barely audible to the people watching. What kind of assumptions? Justice Washington pressed, but his tone wasn't harsh. It was more like a teacher asking a student to work through a difficult problem. Danny looked down at his feet. I assumed you didn't belong in this neighborhood because... He stopped, not wanting to say the words out loud. Because I'm black, Justice Washington finished for him. You saw an older black man driving a regular car through a wealthy neighborhood, and you decided that was suspicious enough to justify a traffic stop. Is that correct? The crowd was completely silent. Even Mrs. Chen, who had been whispering to her neighbor earlier, stopped talking to listen to this conversation. Yes, sir, Danny admitted, his voice cracking a little. That's what happened. Justice, Washington nodded slowly. Officer Rodriguez, I want you to think about something. How many white drivers have you pulled over in this neighborhood for driving carefully and obeying all traffic laws? Danny thought about it for a moment, and the answer was obvious. None, sir. And why do you think that is? Because I wouldn't think it was suspicious if they were white, Danny said, the realization hitting him like a truck. Sergeant Martinez was watching this exchange with growing respect for how Justice Washington was handling the situation. Instead of demanding immediate punishment, he was trying to help Danny understand the deeper problem with his thinking. Officer Rodriguez, Justice Washington continued, I've been a judge for over 20 years. I've seen thousands of cases come through my courtroom, and I can tell you that the biggest tragedy isn't when someone commits a crime. The biggest tragedy is when good people make bad decisions because they've never stopped to examine their own biases. Some of the neighbors were nodding their heads. Mr. Thompson, who lived across the street, had put his phone down and was really listening to what Justice Washington was saying. Now I could demand that you be fired tonight, Justice Washington said, and Danny's face went pale again. I could make sure this video goes viral and destroys your career before morning. I have that power, and frankly, many people would say, you deserve it. Danny felt like he might throw up. Everything Justice Washington was saying was true. But I'm not going to do that, Justice Washington continued, and Danny looked up in surprise. Instead, I'm going to make you a deal. Are you willing to learn from this experience, or are you going to go back to your old ways of thinking as soon as the cameras stop rolling? I want to learn, sir, Danny said quickly. I really do. I can see now that what I did was wrong, and I don't want to be the kind of police officer who treats people differently because of their race. Justice Washington studied Danny's face for a long moment, looking for signs of sincerity. What he saw was a young man who was genuinely shaken by what he had discovered about himself. All right then, here's what's going to happen, Justice Washington said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in the courtroom. Officer Rodriguez, you're going to spend the next month doing community service in this neighborhood, not as punishment, but as education. You're going to meet the people who live here, learn their stories, and understand that a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the car they drive. Sergeant Martinez looked surprised but impressed by this approach. Justice Washington, that's very generous of you, but are you sure that's enough? This incident could have ended very badly. Sergeant, firing Officer Rodriguez might make people feel better in the short term, but it won't solve the real problem. The real problem is that he's probably not the only officer in your department who thinks this way. This incident is a symptom of something bigger. Mrs. Chen called out from her porch. Justice Washington is right. We need our police officers to understand our community better, not just get rid of them when they make mistakes. Other neighbors started nodding and voicing their agreement. They could see the wisdom in Justice Washington's approach. But there do need to be consequences, Justice Washington continued, turning back to Sergeant Martinez. Officer Rodriguez needs additional training on constitutional rights and racial bias, and I want him to write a report about what he learned from tonight's experience that can be shared with other officers in your department. Danny looked relieved but also determined. Sir, I'll do whatever you think is right. I want to be better than I was tonight. Justice Washington smiled for the first time since the traffic stop began. That's all any of us can do, Officer Rodriguez. Try to be better tomorrow than we were today. By now, several news vans had arrived on the scene. Word had spread quickly through social media, and reporters were setting up cameras and trying to interview neighbors about what they had witnessed. Justice Washington looked at the growing media presence and sighed. He knew that by tomorrow, this story would be national news. His phone was probably already ringing with calls from reporters, legal analysts, and politicians wanting to comment on what had happened. Sergeant Martinez, I think it's time for everyone to go home, Justice Washington said. Officer Rodriguez and I have both learned something important tonight, and I think the community has seen that it's possible to address these issues without destroying people's lives. As the crowd began to disperse, Danny approached Justice Washington one more time. Sir, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to meet with me again in a few weeks? I'd like to update you on what I've learned and make sure I'm on the right track. Justice Washington extended his hand for a handshake. Officer Rodriguez, I'd be honored to meet with you again, and I want you to know that I believe people can change if they're willing to do the hard work of examining themselves honestly. As Danny shook his hand, he realized that this night, which had started as the worst mistake of his career, might actually turn out to be the moment that made him a better police officer and a better person. Justice Washington got back into his Toyota Camry and finally drove the last 2 blocks to his house where his wife was waiting on the porch. Having seen the news vans and wondering what in the world had happened to make her husband so late coming home from their grandson's soccer game, the story of what happened that night would indeed become national news, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of being just another example of police misconduct, it became a story about how understanding and education could triumph over prejudice and fear, one conversation at a time.